As we enter Area 6, we pull into the 1800s, the great century for Protestant missionary activity. While William Carey receives much of the credit as the father of the modern missions movement, there are many other remarkable figures with whom we will cross paths in the weeks to come, and even a few this week that we will get to see as well. I think it's worth noting that the great Protestant missionary century begins with another period of national revival in the United States. The First Great Awakening had busted out in the 1730s and 1740s, and we read about that recently, largely under the influence of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Eventually, however, the religious fervor associated with this event begins to wane, and before long another period of religious stagnation has settled in the nation. One significant factor during this time was war. The colonies were at war with England throughout much of the 1770s, and history reveals that prolonged periods of war upset all areas of life. Economics, education, and religious life all take a hit. After the war, another period of spiritual apathy sinks in until stirrings of revival swell up again in the late 1790s. This Second Great Awakening, like the first, started in the Northeast. This one most likely saw some of its first revival action at Yale University. But this later movement would find its greatest impact in the West and in the South. Be aware that by 1800, the newly formed United States of America was beginning to expand westward into Tennessee and Kentucky, Illinois and Ohio, what was considered the frontier at that period of time. Immigrants from Western Europe were streaming into the new nation, not only adding to the population density in many of the big cities on the East Coast, but many others made their way south and west to more open territories and the promise of land. Many historians of this time period point out that it was a rough and tough crowd that headed for the frontier. They were people who valued their freedom and their individualism. Not surprisingly, the Christianity that would take hold on the frontier would emphasize both freedom and individualism as well. The earliest stages of the revival occurred in Congregationalist circles. Those folks were formerly known as Puritans, and Presbyterian circles. These denominations and their ministers, while at home on the East Coast and in their more formal churches, were not always the most comfortable trekking to the frontier with the gospel. It was the smaller upstart denominations like the Methodists and the Baptists and the Disciples of Christ who felt most at home on the frontier, and their church polity enabled rapid expansion to take place. For example, unlike the Presbyterians who required their clergy to have a certain level of education, there were no such requirements in Baptist or Methodist circles. If someone felt called to preach, and a local church agreed, that was all that you needed. Baptists and Disciples were strongly independent and congregational in nature, so there were no restrictions when a preacher gathered a critical mass of people and wanted to start a church. Even though Methodist government worked through a bishop, it was still fluid enough that it did not restrict growth on the frontier. I'll have more to say about the Second Great Awakening in our next lecture, but for now I hope that you recognize how much impact this movement had on the development of this emerging nation. This awakening helped new denominations to rise to places of prominence. It emphasized an emotional style of preaching and response that are still characteristic of many evangelical churches in the South. And in the next lecture, we will also see how the awakening had a direct impact on American churches and students and their vision for missions.